Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Job Accommodation Network Ask Jan Q&A series webcast, the Motor Team Edition. My name is Tracy DeFreitas, and I'm a Jan program leader and director of training and outreach. Today, I will be the moderator for this webcast because I am joined by my Jan consultant colleagues, Lisa Mathis, Julie Davis, and Sarah Eggleston. All specialize in providing guidance on workplace accommodations for individuals with motor and mobility related health conditions and limitations, and interactive process strategies. Thank you all for joining us and sharing your expertise with us today. This Ask Jan Q&A Motor Team Edition training will include a guided discussion on some motor mobility related health conditions and limitations and accommodation topics. Our experts will also field attendee questions throughout the webcast. Finally, before we begin, we want to remind everyone that next month is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, or NDEAM. Celebrated annually in October, NDEAM is an opportunity to educate everyone about the value and talent people with disabilities add to the workforce, and to recognize the progress made and, most importantly, make a commitment to building a stronger, more equitable, and inclusive workforce going forward. NDEAM's purpose is really to reaffirm our commitment to ensuring workers with disabilities have access to good jobs every month of the year. That's the spirit behind this year's official theme, which is access to good jobs for all. Each year, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODAP, our funding agency, they do work closely with its partners and other organizations to develop the NDEAM theme and to help organizations participate in NDEAM activities. And this includes developing and distributing an annual poster that's made available. The 2024 poster features a collage of photos of diverse people with a range of disabilities working in various inclusive workplaces. And these photos appear in colored circles against a blue sky background. Underneath the photos, you will find a white background with a graphic image of black and winding road leading up to these images. So this is in celebration of NDEAM. You can actually access this poster, and there is an option to download the poster. You can also customize it to some extent. So you can learn more information about that by going to the ODAP DOL website at dol.gov/NDEAM. Okay, let's begin our training. Lisa, I'm going to turn things over to you now.
All right, thank you, Tracy. Okay, so so everyone is on the same page about what to expect in this presentation today. In case we have new faces in the audience, I am going to give a little just explanation of what we do here at the Job Accommodation Network. And then in case you're wondering what is motor, what is the motor team, what's the mobility team, I am going to explain what we do here on the motor team. And today's webcast is that question and answer format. So I hope you guys all are motivated and eager to ask your motor related questions. But in case you guys are quiet or hesitant to put in your question in the question and answer box, we do have some accommodation topics to help generate ideas or conversation and shed light on some of the issues that we most often deal with here on the motor team. So those accommodation topics are going to be computer access, parking related issues, accommodations for remote workers, ergonomics, and then we can get into some medical documentation missteps. So with that, let's get started. So in case you don't know about the Job Accommodation Network, welcome to our webcast series. We pride ourselves on being the leading source of free, confidential accommodation guidance. We're trusted. We talk about accommodation issues that fall under Title I of the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, all for free. So we'll talk to employers about how to accommodate someone on staff that happens to have a disability, but we'll also talk to individuals of how to advocate and request those accommodations in the workplace. Because we all know the benefits, direct and indirect benefits that employees that happen to have disabilities provide to our workforce We've been at this for over 40 years. Even before the ADA was a federal law, Jan was providing accommodation solution information. We are funded through the Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP, under the Department of Labor. So, like I said, we're a free consulting service. We're a very small but mighty office. Our central office is here in Morgantown, West Virginia, on the campus of West Virginia University. There's probably only about 25 Jan staffers, and about a dozen of us do the consulting services. So, like I said, we're small but mighty. Next slide. Okay, so getting into what we do, Julie, Sarah, and myself, and we also have two other colleagues that can't be here today, but we're going to get into what we do on the motor team. Okay, so motor team. Motor in and of itself means movement of the body. So you'll see on this slide, gross motor, which are those larger muscle groups, movement of those larger muscle groups. So that can look like sitting limitations, standing limitations, walking, or lifting. And then you'll also see on the slide the fine motor limitations. So those are the small, more precise movements of the muscle, the smaller muscle groups. So oftentimes we think of our hands. So that's the fingering, the feeling, the sensing, the grasping, the pinching movement. And then we also talk about a wide range of disabilities and medical conditions on the motor team. So we can talk about amputation, arthritis, gastrointestinal disorders, heart issues. And just a reminder that just because they're listed on the slide or just because we were talking about it today, doesn't mean it's absolutely covered by ADA, doesn't mean it's not covered by ADA. We're just talking about conditions that we see most often from our GN customers. So you can see that the motor team covers a lot of ground. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Julie, to get into the accommodation topics.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Lisa. Like Lisa stated, we cover a broad range of disabilities here on the motor team. Let's discuss some of the common motor accommodation topics that we address here at JM on the motor team. Next slide, please. First, let's talk about computer access. Conditions like carpal tunnel, tendonitis, Parkinson, and arm impairments can cause pain and or weakness in the hands and arms, along with numbness and tingling in the fingers, hands, and wrist. These limitations may make it difficult for one to complete essential job tasks such as typing, grasping, and other fine motor tasks. One of the most common questions we receive on the motor team is, are there ways to access a computer besides the traditional keyboard and mouse? Let's take a look at some of those alternatives. Some of the alternatives for keyboarding that you may want to consider is alternative keyboards, sometimes called ergonomic keyboards or adjustable keyboards, maybe fixed split keyboards, adjustable split, or contoured. Many increase typing comfort, and several can be positioned to accommodate individuals' preferences, including negative and positive tilt positions. Miniature keyboards, these are the smaller keyboards. They're smaller than a standard keyboard, but still contain all the keys and functioning needed to input information. They can be used by individuals with limited dexterity or one-handed typists. Miniature keyboards can be wired, wireless, or Bluetooth and are flexible. One-handed keyboards, they would assist individuals who must enter data into a computer but have no or limited use of one or more or both hands. Keyboards can be configured to be used by either the left or the right hand. Due to the placement of the keys, individuals that may benefit from using a one-handed keyboard may need some time to learn how to use and type in a different way. Key guards are molded plastic overlays with holes that isolate each key. Key guards provide keying control and accuracy for individuals who use pointing sticks or other typing aids. Traditionally, a computer user accesses a computer with a standard point and click mouse and a QWERTY keyboard. The computer takes the information that is inputted and processes it. Individuals with physical, sensory, or developmental limitations may not be able to use these standard input devices effectively and may benefit from using speech recognition software. Standard computer input devices are keyboards made for typists who use 2 hands and 10 fingers. Speech recognition software is made for computer users with a variety of impairments and limitations, including individuals with no hands or finger movement. The next slide. Alternative mice may be needed to access the information also on the computer. Sometimes the alternative mice may need to be used in tandem with alternative keyboards to be an effective accommodation. An alternative mouse is a variation of the traditional mouse. Alternative mice usually are designed to help accommodate individuals with various fine motor limitations, spasticity, or other gripping limitations. For example, an individual who cannot grip a traditional mouse due to arthritis, carpal tunnel, or a hand injury may be able to move a cursor effectively with a glide point, trackball, joystick, or other device. Some examples of alternative mice could be a tremor limiting mice, which are designed to reduce the effects of tremors and spasticity. These mice may be beneficial for those with Parkinson's and other related conditions. Sometimes an individual may have no use of the hands or very limited use, so the following input devices may be helpful. The breath and mouth controlled alternative computer input device is a sip and puff mouth controlled mouse alternative for quadriplegic individuals and others who have lost the mobility to operate a traditional computer mouse. Head controlled input devices are controlled with head movement. Eye controlled computer input devices can monitor eye movement and instate them as movements on a computer screen of a mouse or across the digital keyboard. Lastly, feet-controlled input devices are controlled by the feet and foot pressure. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa to discuss some parking.
Okay. Thanks, Julie. So getting into parking as an accommodation, oftentimes parking is a benefit of employment that some employers do provide to their employees. And it's clear under the ADA that if you do provide parking, employers must also provide accommodations so employees with disabilities can access benefits of employment, which could include parking. What is not so clear under the ADA is how far employers have to go when providing parking related accommodations. So there can be a variety of reasons someone might need parking related accommodations or accommodations to access the parking lot. That could be walking issues. They might use a mobility aid, a scooter, or a wheelchair, or perhaps they have a climbing restrictions where they can't climb the stairs either to or from the parking lot to get to the work site. There might be stairs in between the parking lot and the work building. Also, keep in mind that just because your parking lot might be technically ADA accessible and has enough of those blue painted parking spots, you might have to go beyond what you already have as that accessible parking lot and to accommodate an employee with a disability that needs reserved parking as a form of an accommodation. There's lots of accommodation. We always tell our customers to kind of think outside the box, get creative whenever you're trying to accommodate a parking related issue. There can be definitely challenges with a person with a disability getting to and from work. Parking can definitely serve as a barrier to the work site. And when employers create where work is performed, that could evolve into a work-related barrier, that parking or lack thereof. So accommodation solutions that could be useful, creating or adding accessible parking spots to an existing employee lot. You might be able to provide assigned reserved parking in the closest lot that is available. Moving someone's workstation, that's something employers don't think of too often. We think that people's offices are where they're assigned, that's where they're going to work. But can we move them down to the first floor, down to, even if it's a rear entrance, move someone's workstation down there if that rear entrance happens to be closer to the parking lot? That could be an effective accommodation for some people. Transporting employees from distant parking areas. Oftentimes in some cities, there's an off-site parking lot, but the accommodation might be to transport people from that off-site parking lot to the workstation. And then an idea to completely eliminate parking as a barrier is letting employees work from home. If those essential functions are doable from home, let's take parking out of the equation and implement telework so we're not even concerned about where the person is going to, park when they arrive to work. Parking, it's definitely a gray area under ADA. If you have detailed nitty-gritty questions, I definitely encourage you to do a one-on-one consult with one of us by calling the 800 number or chatting in. But a common question we get with parking is, can my employer deny access to the parking lot if I have one of those state-issued placards? I have the blue hanger that hangs from my rearview mirror, so they can't say anything to me if I park in one of the blue spots. We get this question very often. And to answer that, the the medical condition or the documentation to get that state issued placard, that might not be the same definition of disability outlined under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it could be two different definitions. So it's really apples and oranges. Another thing is those state issued placards are often for public accommodations like the stores, the retailers, the movie theaters. Oftentimes those placards are applicable in an employer owned private parking lot for employees only. So most times, just because you have a placard, you still might be following Title I interactive process rules for requesting an accommodation, furnishing limited medical documentation, and your employer can go through the accommodation process to explore accommodation options. It's not an automatic access just because you have a state issued placard in your employer owned parking lot. Um, Another thing that comes up with the placards, if all your employees who have placards are parking in the blue spots, and then there's no accessible parking spaces for your customers or clients, that could trickle down to an undue hardship. That can disrupt business if customers with disabilities don't have anywhere to park and they have their own placard. And so the ability to serve customers adequately could make the argument of whether it's reasonable or not to have an employee park in one of those blue spots up front in front of the building. So those are kind of some things to consider. We do have a whole resource on parking linked on the website that's plugged into the chat. I do have an example for parking here, just to kind of illustrate our parking accommodation. Here we have a purchasing clerk had an injury and had to have one of his legs amputated. He was having difficulty walking from the parking lot to his workstation. So here the solution was pretty simple. The employee was given a reserved parking spot close to the work site as an accommodation. I mentioned we have the parking publication linked on the slides, and you can get those after the presentation. But if you have detailed parking questions, definitely give us a call. But with that, Tracy, have questions come flooding in yet?
Well, I can take a look here if you're ready
Okay.
for one. Yeah,
Yeah, I think so.
absolutely. Let me see here. So here's a question related to an employee who would work on site. So if an employee would be able to work on site by using a walker or a wheelchair, but they refuse to get one, can an employer push that issue if remote work is not a good option?
Okay, so I would tell an employer medical decisions are an employee's personal decision. You don't know why someone chooses to take the medication or medical devices such as a walker or scooter, or why they don't do that. It could be a financial thing, it could be a dignity thing. So really, I would try to shift employers' focus to what you can control. And what you can control is that work-related barrier of the parking lot. And so even if someone opts not to utilize a walker, under ADA, there's still that obligation to accommodate them even if they choose not to do the medical device or medication. So I think there's still an obligation to look at parking as an accommodation if telework's not feasible, moving the workstation closer to the parking that is available.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. I do have a question. It's not related to the parking topic, but it kind of goes back to some things that Julie was talking about. So there was a question around whether Jan can recommend a particular speech recognition software program. So can you tell us a little bit about, how do we handle those types of questions?
Usually on our website, we just have a vendor listing. Jan doesn't endorse one specific vendor over another, but we do have a vendor listing that we can provide to the employer or the employee, and they can choose among those which they think may be the most effective for their needs.
All right, very good. Thanks, Julie. And of course, we don't recommend or endorse, products, but we definitely want to get people on the right path to finding the equipment they need. So very helpful. All right, let's see if there's anything else here I can throw out. Um, so back to parking here, Lisa. What if we have a parking lot that's leased from a landlord and it's not a public lot and it's not owned by the employer? What kind of situation would we be in with that?
Yeah, we see that a lot, like in the bigger cities. I mean, that's the situation at Jan here in Morgantown. Um, and so now, whenever the employer leases spaces from that parking garage, now it's really a shared obligation. Parking garage probably falls under Title III, a duty to accommodate the public and their customers, and our employer is their customer. So there's going to be it's kind of a shared obligation. So really, whenever you're making these contracts of rental agreements and real estate agreements, it's better to do it before the contract really starts of who's going to outlining who's going to implement accommodations. So for parking, really it might be designating so many spots for the employer's use that are closer to the work site. It's going to boil down to an undue hardship, what's reasonable, because it probably might cost the employer more to get kind of reserved premier parking, but they have an obligation to accommodate their employees absent hardship. But the garage also has a duty to accommodate their customers, which is the employer. So it's a shared obligation. And really, that's why it's important before an issue arises to outline in those contracts who's going to implement accommodations. Um, so yeah, so it's really a shared obligation. Neither one should evade responsibility of providing accommodations. And that's, you're going to have a discussion with the property manager of, hey, I have 5 employees that need these parking spaces, how can you work with me and kind of engage in that interactive process, open communication with that property manager.
Okay, all right. Here's an interesting question. So, how do you handle it when an employee has multiple disabilities? So, for example, maybe somebody has both a vision impairment and they also have carpal tunnel syndrome. And in terms of ergonomics and the equipment they might need for, using their workstation, any thoughts around that?
Sarah, you're the ergonomics queen.
Well, in just a few slides, I'll be talking about ergonomic related accommodations. But I think that Julie gave us a good summary of some of the tools that might be available. And every accommodation is really a trial and error. And we can't say what we know will work or won't work with individuals' different systems that they need to operate. So it really is a trial and error and helping work with the employee to identify where the priorities are of what is most important to be addressed and then move down the list. So it really is a case by case process.
All right, thank you. I think we'll move to the next topic real quickly, and then I'll keep reviewing some questions and we'll come back to them.
Wonderful. All right, I'm next on Telework. So, Lisa gave a good intro to that. There are times where parking is an issue, and maybe telework is a solution. And for those of us in the disability management field, we've been encouraging telework for decades, but it did take the worldwide pandemic for us to really realize how valuable that can be for individuals, especially with disabilities. But we understand that there's employers that have policies that they want to create to bring people back. They have real estate that they've acquired that they want to occupy. So it really becomes a challenge finding that right fit for teleworking. But individuals that typically contact us, which are a lot of employers and employees who contact Jan about telework concerns, usually it stems around commuting. Individuals have motor issues, so maybe they can't operate a vehicle for a period of time. They might be in a cast or have a healing from an injury, suppressed immune system, so they're concerned about exposure, toileting and grooming. Maybe it's just a dignity thing. Maybe they can't access a bathroom close, or even fatigue. So um, those are a number of reasons why people might ask to telework. What's really important for the employers to realize is that even though you make these policies to get people back to the work, you may want to consider modifying these policies when an individual with a disability who's qualified to do their job and do the essential functions of the job in that capacity, to consider them absent undue hardship for telework. So again, we get a lot of questions. Feel free to circle back or post your questions in the Q&A, anything related to telework. But one of the common questions we get is, are the employers required to provide the equipment for their home office? And during the pandemic, the answer to this was clear because it was a mandate, and the answer was yes, because they were asking people to work from home due to the pandemic. Post-pandemic, I think you want to look at whether similarly situated employees get their equipment provided in their home offices. And if that is true, then you would want to offer the same benefit to individuals with disabilities. But if you don't, it's really a case-by-case determination. Absent undue hardship, best business practice might be to consider it, but this is really a gray area, and the EEOC does not specifically address any requirement. So speaking of equipment, next slide, please. Um, so ergonomics. And ergonomics, Julie shared a lot of the equipment that might be solutions for people that have motor impairments. Ergonomics to me is a lot about the relationship between the person and the environment. And so much of that has to do with their knowledge of posture and positioning and habits and practices. And those things will have a great impact on someone's ability to be accommodated in the workplace. So typical kind of ergonomic topics that we get are people that have limitations relating to sitting, standing, just general pain management, and use of their input devices. So the training piece of this is really that if you have limitations with sitting, it's about the static, usually it's about the static position of being in one position. And movement is really key, and we know that on the motor team. And so the ability to understand changing your postures, but also having a chair that provides good support can be critical to being able to sit back in a chair. And when one sits back, they are free to move. So it kind of facilitates movement if you have a chair that allows you to sit back. And with standing, a lot of the accommodations are around, again, that static stand. It's about being in a standing position for long periods of time. So sometimes anti-fatigue matting can help, stand lean stools that would let you kind of offload your weight, and obviously having that ability to alternate between sitting and standing. Pain management, this is, there's so many ways in which people manage pain, and ideally alternating one's position can help significantly. But I'm going to talk in the next slide, and don't go there yet, but on the next slide about posture and how there's some ideal positioning that we want to be in. And I'm going to leave you with one little tidbit to try back at your own station. But finally, with the input devices, having them on the edge of a surface would allow you to maintain somewhat of a neutral posture and not extend in a reach, not possibly lean into your desk and maybe be static against your desk, but keeping your input devices towards the end will help in that. So one of the questions we get is, how do you find a good ergonomic chair? And just like the individual asked the question about how do you prioritize your accommodations, finding a good chair falls back to that trial and error, which is really, there is not one chair that fits all. So we can't just say this chair and would meet your needs. And again, to Tracy's point, we don't endorse any specific vendor or product, but having the ability to adjust the chair and taking the time and educating oneself on how to make those changes will really allow you to get more comfortable within your chair. So the next slide, Tracy. This slide is wonderful because what I'm going to do is, in the blue box, it titles that this is the OSHA Computer Workstations eTool. So the 5 bullets underneath that reference the 5 tabs on the OSHA page that give you ideas about good working position and workstation components. The checklists are excellent. That's the 3rd tab in, and that's going to even talk to you about, like, how do you pick out an ergonomic chair? What would be features that you would want? Armrest, back support, height adjustability. So it will go into some of those specific components. What I like about this page is there's also this checklist on purchasing, and underneath, for example, a wrist rest, it actually talks more about how you use the product. So a wrist rest is meant to only be used when you're at rest. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. So they might rub against this rest rather than having it available to them when they're at rest. So how you work and how you organize your work is going to affect that comfort and that pain management. And even there's a component of this page that talks about the importance of just awareness of your medical. So if you feel symptoms, taking time to try to address that, troubleshoot it, using some of these tools would be wonderful. And they're free, like Jan. So a great resource to consider. Now, the gal in the image, so at the far side of the slide is a woman sitting back in her chair. What I want to share and just leave you with about ergonomics is her arm posture. So her forearm is vertical, her elbows are by her side, and her upper arm, I'm sorry, is vertical. Her elbows are by her side, and her forearm is level and horizontal to her work surface. So what it shows and demonstrate is someone kind of keeping that neutral posture, keeping their elbow by their side, allowing them to have their input devices kind of below that relaxed elbow height. And it's so critical to one's comfort, whether you're sitting, standing, any kind of use of an input device by having it in that position is ideal. Next slide. So just one example, just to give an example of an airline security agent with breast cancer who's dealing with some lymphedema and has to rotate with different stations. So she has to go within different uh, computer areas. Next slide, please. And the solution is to educate her first so that she understands what adjustments she needs to make, but also to provide equipment that has adjustability. So height adjusted stations, chairs maybe that have adjustment features that she can modify within each station, and even monitors maybe that raise or lower based on her stature and what she needs. But by doing this, the company both educates her and she's able to get a good arrangement at her workstation, but they're also doing a general education for their population to help everyone find a more comfortable ergonomic setup that fits their needs. Next slide and questions.
Okay, let's see what we have here. Um, so we have provided speech recognition, but the employee is still having issues with accessing the information. What can we do?
Sometimes when you provide speech recognition, like I said, you need those alternative input devices. You may have to look in some other type of weighted mouse to see if that helps with the speech recognition. Also, you may want to contact the vendor directly and ask them if they have any help because sometimes they can work out those glitches that you're having with your IT department or the individuals having with accessing the information.
We also have a training resource on our site. So sometimes it's a matter of just getting additional training on how to use the device can sometimes help as well.
Okay, very helpful. So here's a question around the commuting issue. So do we need to consider accommodations for commuting if the employee is only having difficulties that impact their commute, but they have no issues performing essential functions once they get to work?
The answer is yes, because the employer controls where an individual works. And so you do want to consider, absent undue hardship, accommodations that may involve, in this case, maybe it's the telework. Maybe that's the solution that allows them during this period of time where they have issues related to commuting.
Yeah, other accommodations for commute issues. Um, And like Sarah said, yes, that should be considered. You probably don't have to physically transport employees to and from work unless you do so for all employees. But the accommodation might be changing the location of where work is performed. So telework, that's often the fallback accommodation just because it makes sense. But other considerations, whenever someone can't commute, you might be looking at that medical documentation. What are the limitations? How long can they commute? Because some people can't be in hour and a half standstill traffic because they have sciatica or something, but they might be able to drive 20 minutes. And if you have a satellite office within 20 minutes, that could be an accommodation, reassigning them
Mhm.
to an office
Mhm.
closer to their home. That's less of a commute, right? And then another thing is a modified schedule. So if someone physically can't drive, say for a vision impairment or someone is blind, can they utilize public transportation? But we all know bus routes and bus times might not be when our work schedule typically is. So we might be modifying our work schedule, something that aligns with that bus transportation. So you might be modifying the schedule because we control the time of when work is
Mhm.
performed to enable someone with a disability to utilize their own public transportation. So there's a couple considerations whenever commute is the typical barrier.
All right, very helpful. There's a lot to consider
Mhm.
there. We do have some resources on that too on our website, so certainly check into that. I do want to make note the OSHA eTool that Sarah was mentioning earlier, the link for that is included in the chat. So if you're interested in that, please do grab it from the chat. And of course, it's in the PowerPoint. All right, let me see here. So this is an interesting situation, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it a little bit, but this employer has someone in their safety, health, and environmental group that's certified to do ergonomic workplace evaluations. So it looks like this employer does oftentimes refer people to this group or this specialist when they are requesting accommodations for on-site or remote work. And so they're encouraged to go through this person or this group in order to get suggestions related to desk chairs and other equipment before. And this is done apparently before equipment is purchased necessarily as an accommodation. So I guess the question is kind of, do we see any issues with this rigor in this process before approving accommodations? I'm just wondering about your thoughts around that.
Well, it is common in the ergonomic world to have a gatekeeper, somebody that understands maybe the environment and the products that that company is using, things that might be compatible or what other resources might be available within the organization. So I don't think that it's taking away from an interactive process. In fact, it seems like it's part of that interactive process. Um, by providing education and assessment and training, it might be that there's alternatives that the person would benefit from, maybe that they didn't think of. Or maybe there are some organizational or adjustment changes, maybe that would help the individual that don't involve the purchase of equipment. So I can kind of imagine a lot of different scenarios. I mean, of course, we don't know because we're not in that person's shoes, but I do think that is something that we see for managing the purchasing of equipment and having someone get the help that they need to be comfortable at their workstation and make an accommodation.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Mhm.
I'll throw one more question out and then we'll come back to the content. So this gets on the topic of sort of temporary needs. So what if there's a temporary need for a closer parking space due to difficulty walking long distances? The example thrown out was pregnancy. How do we handle those types of situations?
I, Better business is to consider their accommodation. If it's an easy enough accommodation, even if technically the person doesn't rise to the level of an ADA defined disability, if it's an easy enough accommodation, I think it shows a good faith effort. It keeps the person working. I think it's a win-win for both parties. Um, Without getting opening a can of worms, there's the new federal law that we have to be mindful for employees that are pregnant, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. So that has its own accommodation statute that we need to consider. But focusing on ADA, if it's in a temporary impairment or a temporary condition, oftentimes the accommodation's also going to be temporary. So if it's, again, easy enough to implement, why wouldn't you? And for any temporary accommodation, I would encourage you to kind of document that it is in fact temporary, just because memories fade and people get attached to things. So have everyone kind of sign off on something that, hey, this is temporary. We're going to revisit this in 6 months. We might not be able to do it beyond that, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And we do have a form for documenting temporary accommodations. Of course, Jan does. We have a form for everything. Um, so, so yeah, I think it's better business practice to consider it, even for these temporary things. If you're not going to go through the whole hoopla of determining ADA, if it's easy enough, why not?
All right, thank you. All right, well, we'll go ahead and continue with the content for now.
Okay, let's discuss medical documentation missteps now. This is something that we deal with daily at JN, not just on our team, but all over, I mean, on the other teams also. Employers not knowing what to ask for. So, some of the common missteps that you could make is asking for medical documentation that does not meet job-related and consistent with business necessity threshold, and asking for unnecessary information or information that is known from perhaps a workers' comp or FMLA claim, and requiring information to be on a standard form, although the individual has provided the information except in a different format. So, a common question we get here is how much medical documentation can you request? Well, let's look at what the EEOC says because the EEOC is very clear on what you can ask for. According to the EEOC guidance, when the disability and or the need for accommodation is not obvious, the employer may ask the individual for reasonable documentation about his or her disability and functional limitations. The employer is entitled to know that the individual has a covered ADA disability for which they are requesting a reasonable accommodation. Reasonable documentation means that the employer may request only the documentation that is needed to establish that a person has an ADA-related disability and that the disability necessitates a reasonable accommodation. Thus, an employer, in response to a request for accommodation, cannot ask for documentation that is unrelated to determine the existence of an ADA-related disability and the necessity for an accommodation. This means that in most situations, an employer cannot request or require a person to disclose a whole medical record. If an individual has more than one disability, an employer can request information pertaining only to the disability that requires an accommodation. And back to if the accommodation is obvious, like if someone is it's an obvious disability, you probably wouldn't want to request that medical documentation because you know what the limitations are because you can actually see what's going on with the individual. In requesting documentation, employers should specify what type of information they are seeking regarding the disability, its functional limitations, and the need for reasonable accommodations. The individual can be asked to sign a limited release if you would choose it to do it that way, to allow the employer to submit a list of questions to the healthcare provider or to ask those questions directly to the healthcare provider. As an alternative to requesting medical documentation, we sometimes say, talk to the employee. They know what they need best. So if you can't get that medical documentation, having that discussion with the employee, asking them what their limitations are, what they need help with, could be helpful. An example I want to go over is if an employee says to an employer, I'm having trouble reaching tools because of my shoulder injury. The employer may ask the employee at that point for documentation describing the impairment, the nature, the severity, and duration of the impairment, the activity or activities that the impairment limits, and the extent to which the impairment limits the employee's ability to perform the essential functions of the job. So some other resources that we have on our website that may be helpful regarding medical documentation and avoiding those missteps, a flexible approach to ADA medical documentation, to ask or not to ask, knowing when to request medical information, and enforcement guidance on reasonable accommodation and undue hardship under the ADA, specifically question number 6. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa to talk about some issues with recertification.
Okay, so yeah, continuing with those common missteps when it comes to asking for medical exams or medical inquiries. We see this a lot. An employer has a company policy. We ask for annual recertification, no matter who it is, no matter what accommodation they have approved. Every calendar year, we're going to have everyone with an ADA accommodation resubmit all medical and all information to support that accommodation need. We often see it for other issues as more of on a monthly basis. We see these recertification policies and practices. Recertification in and of itself, it might not be a bad thing. It could be appropriate in limited circumstances. I think the important thing to keep in our back of our head is a blanket policy can often get hairy when we're talking accommodation. So having a one size fits all policy for everyone, that's when it can get problematic under ADA. But like I said, recertification in limited circumstances could make sense depending on what you have as far as medical documentation goes. So examples that it could be appropriate is if medical documentation indicates that the impairment or the limitations, they're likely to change over time. Well, we now have reason to believe that this accommodation might not be effective over time because we know the disability and medical condition is going to evolve and change. It might get better, it might get worse. And so we know it's not static. So updated medical in that situation could make sense. If that paperwork didn't have a duration for the need of accommodation when it was originally provided, again, there's kind of an unknown. We don't know how long we need to do this. So we're going to circle back and ask for limited update recertification. It doesn't mean we're asking for the full medical documentation all over again. Whenever you're doing this recertification, you should modify your sample forms if you have them to really just hone in on the information you need. Because we know under ADA, we shouldn't be asking for information that we already have. So that's why it's important to modify those sample templates that employers often use. Another reason a recertification could make business sense if there's a change in the impairment, the limitations, or the ability to perform job duties or meet standards. So that's from the employee's side, but often if the employer can't implement that accommodation anymore, then we might have reason that we need to go back and recertify because now we need to explore alternative accommodations. We can no longer continue this accommodation that was originally provided. So we're going to need some updated medical or information to kind of see what we can do now moving forward to still provide that effective accommodation. And then lastly, another time recertification could be appropriate is if you're monitoring it for effectiveness and that the employee indicates a need for a change that requires additional information. So long of the short, a blanket policy probably isn't best business, but really have a reason to ask our employees for that recertification of what you're asking for and why. Second bullet on the slide, requiring medical documentation when it's a request, when the request is a benefit or privilege of employment. So when flexible work arrangements are available to all employees as a matter of policy and practice, and no information or explanation is needed to utilize that benefit or privilege, we shouldn't make it an ADA issue. The quintessential examples of these type of policies or arrangements are ability to work at home a couple days a week, or ability to flex your schedule or make up time so you're not using your annual or vacation time or PTO. So if anyone is allowed to do that, just because someone with a disability requests it as an accommodation, we shouldn't be asking for medical in those situations because it's a benefit privilege afforded to all employees. So don't go through the ADA process if anyone could ultimately use this benefit or privilege. So you basically want to see if your company policy covers the request before asking for medical documentation. If the policy covers it as a benefit or privilege, then don't ask for medical, even if that person with a disability ties it to they request it of, hey, I have this limitation, this is why I need this as an accommodation. Even if they tie it to a disability, you don't want to go asking for medical because company policy covers it. It doesn't need to evolve into an ADA formal accommodation. So often question for this, how often can I ask an employee receiving an accommodation to provide updated medical documentation? So of course, the answer for this is it depends. You want to look at what medical you already have furnished and see if you need updated medical. It's not going to be a one size fits all approach. And also another thing to keep in mind is you might not be seeking full medical like we did with the original accommodation request. You might be just asking for a doctor to provide a note of, hey, the accommodation is still needed, and you're not getting into the diagnosis, those functional limitations, kind of the nitty gritty of the medical documentation. You're literally just substantiating that, hey, this accommodation is still needing, it works, and you're keeping it moving. Of course, Jan has a resource on recertifying the ongoing need for accommodation that's been plugged into the chat and of course on askjan.org. Okay, I think we're going to go back to Tracy and see what other questions have come in.
Okay, let's see here. So, on the topic of restrictions, what do you do if an employee is not following the restrictions set up by their provider?
Well, I'll answer that. So you can't force someone to follow these restrictions. So I think what would be the best thing is to talk to the employee about your concerns, see if there's any updated medical that might differ from what the limitations were. Maybe there's a misunderstanding but just it's best to get clarity around that and return back to that interactive process to understand more about the circumstances around their maybe choice or why it is believed that they're not following their limitations or restrictions. Lisa, do you have more on that?
Yeah, I mean, you really just answered it. It goes back to that open communication.
Mm,
I say this every webcast of how important that open communication is with that individual of, hey, we have this doctor's note. We're observing this happening at the work site.
mhm,
There's a disconnect. Doctor says you're so limited, but we see you lifting more than 50 pounds. We see you walking for 8 hours. And so really getting that employee's input, because it could just be a minor misunderstanding.
mhm,
Um, but I think from an ADA perspective, you don't want to make assumptions. So have a conversation with the employee. And if they're performing the job, safely and you don't have any objective evidence to think they're not safe or not posing a hazard, you're really going to have to look at, are they posing a direct threat under ADA, which is a high standard to meet?
mhm,
And in limited circumstances, we could probably ask for updated medical, and you might be, again, modifying that template and perhaps writing a letter of here's what I observed. In September, you noted there's a lifting restriction. We've observed him lifting more than that uh, weight limit. What's going on? And just kind of getting the healthcare provider weighing in, if it's job related, consistent with business necessity, and to ensure that the person is truly safe to perform and not posing a
mhm,
direct threat to themselves or others. So it's a case by case basis,
mhm.
of course, but don't overlook the full conversation and looping in that employee and kind of seeing what's going on and having an open dialogue with them.
All right, thanks, Lisa and Sarah. I think we have time probably for another one here before we have to close up the webcast. So we think the employee is at risk for a re-injury when they come back to work. Due to this, should we look at reassignment or leave as an accommodation? What are your thoughts around that?
I mean, you shouldn't base your decision on a risk that may happen or an injury that may happen. You should base it on the facts that you have in front of you. I wouldn't even look at reassignment or leave if the person can complete the essential job duties at this point. Do you have anything to put in with that, Lisa?
Yeah, and even if you do just have that, you have the risk, you're still supposed to be looking at accommodations to lessen that risk. So, okay, let's say risk does exist. Now we're exploring through an interactive process what accommodations can lessen that risk so they can safely perform essential functions. And we know that reassignment is an accommodation of last resort. We know that we shouldn't put people out on leave that can otherwise perform their job, that it's a lesser effective form of an
Mhm.
accommodation. So the whole point of the ADA is to keep people working. So again, engage in that interactive process to see how we can lessen that threat if there is one and enable, a safe working condition for all parties.
And they can't be assumed risks. These have to be
Exactly.
known and shown. So, to Julie and Lisa's point, making sure that you have that conversation.
I think we can squeeze one more in. Let's see here. So this is interesting. So let's say someone is asking for a temporary or reserved parking space, and maybe you don't have, I don't know, maybe you don't have a lot of control over that. But how do you physically create a temporary or reserved parking space? What are your creative ideas around providing that type of parking for someone?
Really, so a typical, I have air quotations, an accessible spot is pretty wide just because for the public access parking lots, they're taking into consideration like opening van doors, getting a mobility aid out. And so your employee in an employer controlled parking lot might not need that wide of a spot. So oftentimes you're breaking down one blue accessible spot that could potentially fit two cars because that could be within someone's restriction of they can't walk more than 30 feet and the parking lot's closer. And so for those cases, providing reserve spots, I wouldn't label names on these reserve spots just because you can get into confidentiality issues.
Mhm.
So a number system, so you're not attaching parking spots to names, but it's a more discrete number system so people know not to park in number one, but employee with a disability knows that that's their spot without their medical information being broadcasted to everybody. Um, uh, at the Jan office, there were a couple spots up against the building that were kind of just vacant land, and we were able to get those for accessibility purposes and accommodation purposes. So talking to the building owner, oftentimes there's real estate physically around a building that might not be a traditional parking spot, but it works as an effective accommodation to get that employee in safely and within their restrictions.
All right, you hit all the important points there, Lisa. Good job. All right, well, I think with that, we will close the Q&A portion of this webcast as well as the content. Uh, Thank you all so much. That's really all the time we have today. We do hope this training was informative. And Lisa, Julie, and Sarah, thank you for answering our questions and offering this great information. We really appreciate your expertise. Attendees, if your question was not answered today, remember you can ask Jan. Just contact us. You can use the Jan service for free and directly contact us via our live chat that's available at askjan.org, or you can call at 800-526-7234 or email us at jan@askjan.org. And if you're not already following us on social media, please do. Find the Job Accommodation Network on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and on X at Jan@Jan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate you being here with us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and this concludes our training.